Eleanor Brooks had never asked for much. A life lived in sturdy humility had taught her the value of hard work, sacrifice, and unconditional love. So when her only granddaughter, Lily, announced her engagement, Eleanor quietly offered to pay for the wedding, a gesture of devotion more than obligation. Every spare dollar from her modest savings went toward the dress, the venue, the flowers, the photographs that would capture what she thought would be a legacy of love. But when the day arrived, the joy Eleanor had dreamed of was swiftly soured. Amid the swirls of tulle and champagne laughter, she was quietly ushered aside, told that family photos were just for the immediate family. Moments later, she watched through a cracked door as the family she had helped build posed and smiled without her. Alone, clutching her worn purse, Eleanor realized that sometimes the deepest betrayals are the ones delivered with a soft voice and a polished smile. Yet even in that heartbreak, Eleanor found a path back to her own quiet dignity and to a truth she had nearly forgotten. Eleanor Brooks had spent her entire life in the small town of Willow Creek, where the streets were lined with oaks older than memory, and where every face was familiar, if not always friendly. She had married young, a quiet man named Walter, who loved her in the silent, sturdy way of men raised by the Great Depression. Together, they built a life modest in wealth, but rich in the things that mattered most: faith, family, and hard-earned respect. They lived in a 2-bedroom house with peeling white paint and a rose bush that refused to die no matter how harsh the winters. Eleanor worked as a seamstress, Walter in the hardware store. They never vacationed beyond a county fair or a church retreat, but they never complained either. Gratitude, Eleanor believed, was the backbone of happiness. Their daughter, Susan, grew up loved but restless. She dreamed of bigger things: college, cities, polished lives beyond the dusty edges of Willow Creek. Eleanor encouraged her the best she could, stitching prom dresses by hand, saving for tuition in a coffee tin under the sink. When Susan left for a new life in the city, Eleanor and Walter waved her off with proud, aching hearts. Years slipped by. Susan married a businessman, climbed social ladders Eleanor barely understood, and eventually had Lily, their only granddaughter. Lily, with her golden hair and easy laugh, became Eleanor's brightest joy. Though the visits were few and far between, Eleanor loved her fiercely, sending care packages stuffed with homemade cookies, knitted scarves, and little notes folded with care. When Walter passed away quietly in his sleep after 46 years of marriage, Eleanor bore the grief with the same quiet strength that had carried her through 1,000 small hardships. She wore her black dress, accepted the hugs of well-meaning neighbors, and returned home to a house that felt impossibly large and empty. Lily's calls brought her comfort in those early months of widowhood. She would chatter about college, about boyfriends, about big city dreams Eleanor barely understood, but always celebrated. So when Lily called one crisp autumn afternoon to announce her engagement, Eleanor's heart swelled with pride and bittersweet longing. "Grandma," Lily said, her voice full of excitement, "I'm getting married in June, and, well, it's going to be expensive." Without hesitation, Eleanor offered to help. She had no riches to boast of, but she had saved bit by bit through years of modest living. What good was money if not to bless the ones you loved? Eleanor withdrew nearly all of her savings, carefully accumulated for emergencies and rainy days, and wrote a check to cover the venue deposit, the catering, and a portion of the dress. She mailed it in a crisp white envelope with a handwritten note. "For your happiness, my sweet Lily. Love always, Grandma." She told herself she didn't need recognition or thanks. Love was its own reward. But deep down, a small voice whispered, a hope she dared not speak aloud, that on Lily's special day she would stand proudly among the family, part of the happiness she had helped create. The months leading up to the wedding passed quickly, each week marked by a flurry of planning and excitement that seemed to sweep everyone along. Eleanor, though hundreds of miles away, stayed involved in the only way she could, by writing checks and sending little packages filled with homemade touches, a hand-stitched garter, a lace-trimmed handkerchief, a simple pearl hairpin she had once worn on her own wedding day. Lily responded with hurried, cheerful thank you texts, full of exclamation points, but somehow lacking the warmth that Eleanor remembered from earlier years. Still, Eleanor pushed aside any doubts, telling herself that young people were simply busy and that love did not always need grand expressions to be real. She hung Lily's engagement photo on her living room wall, right next to Walter's picture, and imagined how proud he would have been to see their granddaughter stepping into her future. When the wedding invitation arrived, it was beautiful. Ivory, cardstock embossed with gold, with elegant cursive spelling out her name. Eleanor smoothed her hand over it, feeling a rush of emotion. She circled the date on her calendar with a red pen, bought a new dress in soft lavender, and had her hair trimmed for the first time in months. She even splurged on a hotel room nearby, wanting to be sure she would have a place to rest after the long day. As the day approached, she rehearsed what she might say to Lily, how she would embrace her, how they would laugh and maybe even cry a little together. She imagined herself in the family photos, standing proudly among Susan, Lily, and the groom's family, her simple dress blending into the colorful swirl of celebration, her heart full. On the day of the wedding, Eleanor arrived early, wanting to be sure she found her place without causing a fuss. The venue was grander than she had imagined. A sprawling estate with manicured lawns, marble floors, and glittering chandeliers that caught the late afternoon light and scattered it across the guests in golden beams. Eleanor felt slightly out of place among the polished, fashionable crowd, but she held her head high. She was here for Lily, and that was enough. She found her assigned seat, tucked toward the back of the ceremony area, and settled in quietly. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Lily glided down the aisle like something out of a dream, her dress shimmering, her face radiant. Eleanor dabbed her eyes with a tissue as she watched, memories of Lily as a little girl twirling in the backyard flashing before her. The vows were exchanged, the kiss was sealed, and the guests erupted into applause. Eleanor clapped along, her heart bursting with pride and bittersweet joy. Afterward, everyone was directed to the cocktail hour, while the bridal party prepared for photographs. Eleanor made her way slowly toward the patio, savoring the warm evening air and the sweet scent of blooming roses. She was sipping a glass of lemonade when Susan approached her, smiling in that careful, polite way that people use when they are about to say something unpleasant. Susan's words came gently but firmly, telling Eleanor that the photographer was focusing on immediate family only for the formal pictures, that it would be better if she made herself comfortable elsewhere until dinner was served. For a moment, Eleanor didn't understand. She blinked up at her daughter, wondering if she had misheard. She was family. She had paid for half the wedding. Surely there had been some mistake. But Susan was already smoothing her skirt, already moving away, her attention drawn back to the gathering crowd of younger, shinier guests. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, feeling the heat rise in her face, feeling the edges of the beautiful day crumble quietly beneath her feet. She turned and walked slowly back toward the garden, away from the flashes of the camera, away from the laughter and the swirling celebration that no longer seemed to have a place for her. She found a small bench under an oak tree, sat down carefully, and folded her hands in her lap. Around her, the sounds of the wedding floated on the breeze, music, clinking glasses, the murmur of happy voices. She sat quietly, unseen and unmissed, and realized that somewhere along the way she had become invisible to the very people she loved most. As the evening deepened and the sky softened into twilight, Eleanor sat alone under the oak tree, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her heart heavy in a way she could hardly describe. She watched from a distance as guests mingled and posed for photographs, their laughter rising and falling like waves against the rocks. Somewhere inside the glittering hall, Lily and her groom moved among the crowd, radiant and full of life, surrounded by friends and family who fit seamlessly into the polished, perfect image that had been curated for the day. Eleanor, in her modest lavender dress and worn leather shoes, felt like a relic of a forgotten time. Something sweet but no longer needed, like the lace doilies tucked away in her cedar chest at home. She thought of all the small sacrifices she had made for Lily's happiness, the sleepless nights she had spent sewing to earn extra dollars, the careful budgeting, the lonely days when a letter or a phone call might have meant the world, but never came. None of it had been given with conditions or expectations, but standing there now, brushed aside like an afterthought, she realized how deeply she had yearned for acknowledgement, for belonging, for a place in the circle she had helped to create. As the photographer packed away the equipment and the guests were ushered inside for the reception, Eleanor remained outside for a while longer, breathing in the cool evening air, trying to gather herself. She would not cause a scene. She would not embarrass Lily or herself. Quiet dignity was all she had left, and she would cling to it like a shield. Eventually, when the first strains of music floated through the open doors and the reception began in earnest, Eleanor stood and smoothed the front of her dress. She walked slowly toward the entrance, intending to slip inside unnoticed, to find her seat and eat the meal she had quietly paid for. She would smile politely, clap when appropriate, and slip away before the night ended, no burden to anyone. Inside, the room glowed with warm light, the tables adorned with white linens and towering floral arrangements. Eleanor found her place card at a table near the kitchen doors, far from the head table where Lily and her groom sat laughing with their friends. She sat down quietly, nodding politely at the strangers who shared her table, none of whom seemed to know who she was or why she was there. As the night wore on, Eleanor sipped water from a crystal goblet, pushed food around her plate, and clapped dutifully during the speeches, even as her heart ached with every passing moment. The final blow came when it was time for the traditional family dances. The DJ announced them with great fanfare: the bride and groom's first dance, the father-daughter dance, the mother-son dance. Cameras flashed, guests cheered, and Eleanor sat motionless, invisible, while the family she had loved and supported danced and laughed without her. No one invited her onto the floor. No one acknowledged her presence. It was as if she had ceased to exist. When the dancing grew wild and the music throbbed against the walls, Eleanor decided she had endured enough. She rose quietly, gathered her purse, and made her way to the door. No one stopped her. No one even noticed. She stepped out into the night, the air cool against her flushed cheeks, and walked slowly to her car. The gravel crunched under her. Sensible shoes, the only sound in the vast emptiness of the parking lot. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, gripping the steering wheel tightly to keep her hands from trembling. The drive back to the hotel was a blur. Streetlights shimmered through her tears, and memories crowded her mind. Walter lifting her in his arms on their wedding night, Susan as a colicky baby wailing through the long hours of the night, Lily as a bright-eyed toddler racing through the backyard with wildflowers in her fists. She thought of the countless invisible sacrifices she had made, the ones no one saw, the ones no one remembered. In the small, sterile hotel room, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and slowly removed her shoes. She stared at them for a long time, sensible, sturdy, worn by years of standing, walking, serving others without complaint. She thought of how easily she had been cast aside, how lightly her presence had been treated, and she felt a deep, aching loneliness settle over her. But somewhere beneath the sorrow, something else stirred, something sharper, cleaner. It was the beginning of a resolve, faint but growing. Eleanor would not spend the rest of her days waiting for invitations that would never come. She would not measure her worth by the fickle affections of those who failed to see her. She had loved with an open heart, given with a generous spirit, and lived with honor. No one could take that from her, not even the granddaughter she had adored. She might be simple in the eyes of the world, But her love had been grand, her sacrifices monumental, her life meaningful. And it was time, long past time, to start living for herself. The morning after the wedding, Eleanor awoke early, long before the sun had risen. The hotel room felt cold and impersonal, its beige walls and stiff, white linens offering little comfort. She sat up slowly. The stiffness of yesterday's heartache settled deep in her bones. For a moment, she considered pulling the covers over her head, letting the numbness swallow her. But years of habit, of rising early to tend to chores and responsibilities, no matter how she felt, propelled her forward. She dressed in the same lavender dress she had worn the night before, a little wrinkled now, and combed her hair neatly. She sat at the small desk by the window and watched as the first thin line of dawn split the horizon. As the sky brightened, so too did something within her. It was not a burst of hope or a sudden lifting of sadness, but a slow, steady realization that her life, her worth, could not remain entangled in the disappointments others placed at her feet. She had spent so many years giving, nurturing, holding spaces for others' dreams that she had nearly forgotten she was allowed dreams of her own. Even if they were small, even if they no longer centered around family gatherings and children's laughter, they were hers to claim. Eleanor thought of the garden she had always wanted to start, the trips she had imagined taking with Walter but never dared to do alone. She thought of books she had longed to read, friendships she had neglected. Out of obligation to duty, she realized with sudden clarity that love and loyalty, while noble, should never require the sacrifice of one's own soul. True love, real, enduring love, did not discard, did not diminish. It lifted. It is cherished. She would always love Lily, just as she would always love Susan. That love would remain, a permanent thread in the fabric of her being, but she could no longer allow that love to tether her to sorrow. It was time to loosen the knots. It was time to bless them quietly in her heart and release the expectations that had caused so much pain. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the sterile hotel room, Eleanor felt a surprising peace settle within her. The ache was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She packed her small suitcase methodically, folded her dress carefully, and tucked her few belongings into their places. She glanced once more at the room, a symbol now of both ending and beginning, before stepping out into the cool morning air. In the parking lot, she paused to breathe deeply, feeling the warmth of the new day on her face. Somewhere behind her, the remnants of the wedding celebration would be winding down. Somewhere ahead of her, a life yet unwritten stretched quietly, patiently waiting for her to step into it. Eleanor smiled to herself, small, sure, and unshakably free. The drive back to Willow Creek was long but soothing, a ribbon of road unspooling before Eleanor as fields and hills rolled gently past. She drove with the windows cracked open, letting the fresh summer air rush in, tangling her hair and carrying away the last clinging threads of sorrow. For the first time in months, she wasn't returning home to wait for a phone call or an invitation that might never come. She was returning to herself, to the simple, sturdy life she had built with her own two hands. When she pulled into her driveway, the familiar sight of her little white house with its crooked rosebush brought tears to her eyes, but not of sadness. This was her place, her safe harbor, her proof that a life could be rich even if it didn't always look the way others thought it should. Rufus, the neighbor's old golden retriever who often wandered into her yard, came trotting over, wagging his tail as if welcoming her home. She knelt down, scratched behind his ears, and laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. It felt good to laugh again. Over the next few days, Eleanor moved deliberately through her home, rearranging things not because they needed to be changed, but because she wanted them to reflect her new beginning. She packed away the wedding invitation, the photographs, the keepsakes that had once been displayed so proudly. Not out of anger, but out of a need to make space for new memories, new joys. She pulled out gardening gloves from the closet and began planning the small vegetable patch she had always dreamed of. She ordered seed catalogs and sketched rows of tomatoes, squash, and green beans with the kind of excitement she hadn't felt in years. Neighbors stopped by to say hello, to chat over coffee on the porch. They asked about the wedding, and Eleanor spoke of it kindly but briefly, steering the conversation toward the garden she planned to start, the books she wanted to read, the community events she might finally attend now that she wasn't waiting on anyone else's approval. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns, that Eleanor Brooks was setting down new roots right where she had always belonged. One sunny afternoon, Mabel Perkins, one of Eleanor's oldest friends, invited her to a quilting circle at the church. At first, Eleanor hesitated, the old shyness rising in her. She had spent so long standing at the edges of gatherings, feeling invisible, that the idea of stepping forward felt almost foreign. But then she thought of the promises she had made to herself, the quiet oaths she had sworn in that sterile hotel, room, to live, to belong, to be enough just as she was. So she said yes. The quilting circle was a simple thing. A handful of women gathered around worn tables, laughing and stitching, sharing stories of their children, their gardens, their favorite recipes. Eleanor felt herself easing into the rhythm of their chatter, her hands remembering the familiar dance of needle and thread. She was not the loudest voice at the table, nor the fastest stitcher, but she was there, present and whole, and that was enough. As the afternoon sun slanted through the church windows, casting golden puddles across the floor, Eleanor realized she had built something far more lasting than a fleeting seat at someone else's wedding. She had built a life of her own, rich, with quiet joys and steady love, a life that needed no applause or validation to be meaningful. And for the first time in a long while, she felt not left behind, but exactly where she was meant to be. For a while, life settled into a peaceful rhythm, each day framed by simple routines that brought Eleanor a quiet, steady satisfaction. She spent her mornings in the garden, coaxing tender shoots from the soil, and her afternoons at the library or the quilting circle. Slowly, she began weaving herself into the fabric of the community once more, no longer waiting for invitations that never came, no longer defining her worth by others' approval. It was a gentle rebirth, a reclaiming of the life she had once tucked away behind duty and sacrifice. Yet, life has a way of testing even the strongest resolve when old wounds are not fully healed. It began with an envelope in the mailbox one humid afternoon. Eleanor found it wedged between her electric bill and a seed catalog, her name written in the familiar, looping script of her daughter, Susan. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was an invitation. Another wedding, this time for Lily's younger brother, Matthew. It was to be held at the same glittering estate where Lily's wedding had unfolded, full of grand plans and polished guests. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she read the neat print detailing the rehearsal dinner, the ceremony, the brunch the morning after. At the bottom of the invitation, in small, almost apologetic font, was a note. "We hope you can join us. Seating for the ceremony will be limited to immediate family only." The words struck her like a slap. Immediate family. Once again, the MIA message was clear. She was welcome to stand on the periphery, to smile and nod and keep her distance, but not to be woven into the center of the celebration. Not truly. For days, Eleanor wrestled with what to do. Part of her longed to simply decline the invitation, to spare herself the ache of standing outside the circle once again. But another part, the stubborn, enduring part that had carried her, through decades of hard work and quiet sacrifices, whispered that she deserved better, that she had always deserved better, and perhaps, more importantly, that she was not required to subject herself to spaces that diminished her simply because they bore the name of family. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Eleanor sat on her front porch with a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Rufus dozed at her feet, the scent of freshly turned earth and blooming roses thick in the air. She thought about all the years she had spent trying to earn a place in the hearts of people she had already given everything to. She thought about Walter, who had loved her with a steadfastness that needed no proving. She thought about the friendships she was now nurturing, the simple joys of a life built on her own terms. The next morning, with a steady hand, Eleanor wrote her reply. She declined the invitation with grace, thanking them for thinking of her, but explaining that she had prior commitments she could not break. She signed her name firmly, without apology. She did not explain herself further. She owed no explanations for choosing her own peace. When the day of Matthew's wedding arrived, Eleanor did not sit alone in her house or mourn what could have been. Instead, she packed a small picnic basket, tucked a worn novel under her arm, and drove to the lake, a few miles outside of town. She found a quiet spot beneath a sprawling oak tree, laid out a blanket, and spent the afternoon reading, watching the sunlight dance on the water, and sharing bits of her sandwich with Rufus. At one point, she closed her eyes and simply listened to the birdsong, to the rustle of leaves in the breeze, to the steady, reassuring beat of her own heart. She smiled, feeling a lightness she hadn't known in years. She was not excluded. She was not forgotten. She had simply chosen a different kind of celebration, one that honored her worth without conditions. In the weeks that followed, she heard bits and pieces about the wedding from town gossip, the grand flowers, the lavish dinner, the perfectly posed photographs. And while a small human part of her still ached at the distance that now stretched between her and those she had once loved so fiercely, it no longer consumed her. She had grieved the loss of their closeness. She had honored it, and she had moved beyond it. Eleanor's world continued to grow, slowly and surely. She joined a local book club where she found herself laughing freely among women who valued her stories and her gentle wisdom. She began volunteering at the community center, teaching young girls how to sew, passing on the skills and patience that had once been the foundation of her own survival. Each stitch, each seed planted, each quiet act of kindness felt like a thread mending the tapestry of her life. She had not changed who she was to find acceptance. She had simply found the courage to accept herself. And in doing so, she discovered a new kind of family, not built by blood, but by choice. A family that saw her, valued her, and celebrated her not for what she could give, but for who she was. By late autumn, the garden behind Eleanor's little white house had begun to fade into the muted colors of the season. The last of the tomatoes had been harvested, the sunflowers had bowed their heavy heads, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Eleanor welcomed the change. She found peace in the slow turning of the earth, the way each season demanded its own kind of letting go. It mirrored the quiet work she had been doing within herself, shedding old griefs, planting seeds of new beginnings. One crisp afternoon, Eleanor stood on her porch, a mug of spiced tea warming her hands, when she noticed a familiar car pull into her driveway. It was Susan, stepping out carefully in her tailored coat, her face wearing the polite, guarded expression that had grown between them over the years. Eleanor's heart gave a small, involuntary lurch, but she stayed still, waiting. Susan approached, glancing around as if the quiet simplicity of the place made her uneasy. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice a little too bright. "I was passing through. Thought I'd stop in." Eleanor nodded and opened the screen door wider. "Come in if you like. I just put on some tea." Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Susan sat stiffly at the kitchen table, looking around at the modest surroundings she had once called home, but now seemed foreign to her. They spoke in fits and starts, exchanging small details about the weather, town gossip, the usual safe topics. Then, inevitably, Susan's gaze dropped and the silence between them grew heavy. "I wanted to say," Susan began, picking at the hem of her sleeve, I know things haven't been easy with the weddings, with Lily. I guess we didn't think it would matter." The words hung in the air, raw and clumsy. Eleanor listened, her face calm, her heart steady. She understood now that Susan's life had become a performance, polished and curated for others' approval, and in that world, Eleanor's quiet, unvarnished presence no longer fit easily. It had been easier to set her aside than to reckon with what her steadfastness revealed about their own choices. "It did matter," Eleanor said gently, "but not the way you think. It mattered because it taught me something important." Susan blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Eleanor smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "I realized I don't need to stand in someone else's photograph to be part of something beautiful. I don't need an invitation to know my worth." Susan lowered her eyes, shame coloring her cheeks, but Eleanor felt no triumph, no satisfaction in her daughter's discomfort, only a deep, enduring peace. They finished their tea in relative silence, the conversation finding no perfect resolution, no grand reconciliation. But that was all right. Some relationships could not be neatly mended. Some wounds would always leave a scar. Eleanor had learned that healing did not always mean restoring what was broken to what it had been. Sometimes it meant letting go of what could not be saved and choosing to live fully anyway. When Susan finally rose to leave, Eleanor walked her to the door. She offered a warm hug, one without bitterness or blame, and Susan clung to her just a little longer than expected before pulling away and retreating to her car. Eleanor watched her go, then turned back toward her house, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the porch. She felt the ache of what would never fully heal, but she also felt the strength of what she had built within herself, a quiet, unshakable foundation that no slight, no absence could destroy. Inside, Rufus thumped his tail against the floor in greeting. Eleanor smiled, picked up her knitting, and settled into her favorite chair. Outside, the first leaves of winter whispered across the garden beds, and Eleanor, rooted firmly in her own hard-won peace, was ready for whatever season came next. Winter came softly to Willow Creek, blanketing the small town in a hush of white. The streets grew quiet under the weight of snow, and the familiar world seemed to slow to a thoughtful stillness. Eleanor found herself welcoming the season's demands for simplicity. She spent her days tending to small comforts, baking fresh loaves of bread, mending quilts for the church donation drive, reading thick novels by the fire. The garden lay dormant under its snowy quilt, but Eleanor knew that life was still pulsing, beneath the surface, waiting for spring to call it back. In the quiet of her days, Eleanor reflected often on the path that had led her here. There were moments when the memories of Lily's wedding, of Susan's careful distance, would surface unbidden. Sometimes the sharpness returned, a small sting, behind her ribs, a fleeting ache for what might have been. But those moments no longer ruled her. They passed like winter gusts against a sturdy wall, unable to shake the foundation she had rebuilt within herself. At the library, the quilting circle and the church suppers, Eleanor found steady joy. She was no longer simply Susan's mother or Lily's grandmother, defined by what she could give or what she had lost. She was Eleanor, respected, valued, and, most importantly, seen. There was dignity in the way she carried herself now, not demanding recognition, but offering her presence fully, without apology. One evening near Christmas, as the town square lit up with golden lights and children skated clumsily across the frozen pond, Eleanor joined a group of neighbors for the tree-lighting ceremony. As she stood among them, singing carols under the vast December sky, she felt a fullness in her chest that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the life she had chosen to embrace. Later that night, back at home, she wrote a short letter to herself and tucked it between the pages of her Bible, a promise she intended to keep. It said simply, "I am enough. I have always had enough." Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet and unhurried. Inside, Eleanor sat by the fire with Rufus dozing at her feet, the house wrapped in warmth and light. She was not waiting anymore, not for recognition, not for apologies, not for a place at anyone else's table. She had built her own. As the new year unfolded, Eleanor often found herself sitting on her porch in the crisp mornings, a warm shawl draped over her shoulders and a fresh cup of coffee in hand. She watched the world around her move through its seasons, the subtle changes in the air, the slow awakening of the earth beneath the snow. In those quiet hours, she reflected not on what she had lost, but on what she had reclaimed. She thought of the years she had spent tying her sense of worth to others' approval, mistaking sacrifice for belonging, believing that love meant giving everything without question. It had taken being cast aside to understand that love, real love, was not meant to erase the self. It was meant to nurture it, to strengthen it. She saw now that there had been strength in every decision she had made to survive, every silent endurance, every small act of generosity that came from a heart expecting nothing in return. The betrayal she had endured at Lily's wedding, painful as it was, had also been a doorway, one she had been reluctant to walk through, but one that led to her truest self. She no longer needed to chase anyone's approval. She no longer measured her life by the standards others had set. Her life, simple and unadorned, was full in ways that could never be captured in a photograph or acknowledged in a grand speech. She understood now that dignity was not something given. It was something lived. It was in the quiet rising each day to tend to a garden no one else would see. It was in the laughter shared over quilting tables and the small acts of kindness, woven into the fabric of an ordinary life. It was in knowing your own worth, even when others failed to see it. And sitting there, with the sun warming the frosted fields and the birds beginning to sing their tentative songs of spring, Eleanor felt no bitterness, no anger, only gratitude. Gratitude for the road she had traveled, for the lessons learned, in heartbreak, and for the unshakable peace she had found in choosing herself at last. If Eleanor's journey touched something deep in your heart, share this story with someone who might need a reminder that self-worth is never measured by someone else's recognition. Subscribe for more heartfelt stories of quiet courage, resilience, and the kind of love that endures even when the world looks away. Thank you for being part of a community that believes in the strength of dignity, the healing power of forgiveness, and the quiet victories that define a life well lived.